Walking into our sanctuary today, you can't help but notice the sights of Christmas, right? We hear the sounds as we sing songs about Advent, and we sing, O come, Emmanuel. They're part of what come back year after year after year. Sometimes when we go to out our Christmas decorations, I don't know where that came from. Our Christmas decorations, we discover things in the box that we have treasured year after year and look forward to. But sometimes, at least for me, I occasionally discover something I forgot I had. Maybe I'm the only one, but sometimes I discover something that I forgot I had. In this season of Advent, we're focusing on the sights and sounds of Christmas and how to remind us for the reason of the season. And as part of this series, we're going to be sharing with the children and with the adults meanings of the Christmas decorations, like we talked about the wreath this morning. We're also going to be talking about some of the stories behind some of our favorite Christmas carols. And in fact, if you want to register your favorite Christmas carols are, there's a survey in the back and then up here as well. And today we start with one of those Christmas carols that was discovered after a long time lost. And it's this one, O come, Emmanuel, that we sang this morning. Now, we didn't sing all 7 verses. And I'll tell you, one of the things I've wondered about over the years as we've sang this song, why are there 7 verses? Well, one of the reasons why is because it was traditional to sing this song for the 7 days before Christmas Eve. To sing this song for the 7 days before Christmas Eve, and it reminded the people of the hope that they had of the coming Emmanuel, the God with us. And in fact, this hymn that was originally in Latin takes us back over 1,200 years to the monastic life of the 8th and 9th century, which is where they would sing this song before and after Mary's song, the Magnificat, which we'll talk about a little bit next week. But here we have a song of hope that was lost centuries and then rediscovered in the 1800s. It was discovered by Mason Neale, the famous architect of the Oxford movement, and he found it in the appendix of an early manuscript. And he brought it back to us for us to sing today. I think about those parts of the story that sometimes are easy to forget. You may notice this morning we have our push out, we have the beginning of our nativity scene, but it's a little bit empty, doesn't it? Because all that's there is what? The animals, that's right. All that's there are the animals. And I want us to do it that way because I remind us that hope is most powerful when things feel a little bit empty. That hope is most powerful when things feel a little bit empty. Anybody else, like when things are going really well, busy doing things that you love, you don't really hope a lot of things in the future. You're not focusing on something better to come. But yet when you feel emptiness in your life, feel that emptiness in your heart is when hope is most powerful because it gives you a promise of a better future. I also want to remind us how the Christmas story starts long before the baby is in the manger. The Christmas story starts when things are just going normally, when the animals are what they normally eat, when the shepherds are out in the field doing day-to-day work, day after day, because you know what? Animals have to eat every day, right? And Mary and Joseph are just planning their life together and have no idea that there's an angel that's going to come and change everything. And so we start this season of Advent looking at a story of hope as we look at the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah. And Zechariah are experiencing a struggle that actually a little over 17% of people experience in their lifetime. They're struggling with infertility. Did you know it was that many people? Because it's such a hush-hush thing, a lot of people don't think about that. But 17%, a little over 17% of people struggle with infertility. And in that time period, and sometimes today, people who are experiencing that or other medical issues will occasionally think that it's because God is somehow unhappy with them. And so part of what I want to hear this day is a message about that. But not just for people who are experiencing struggle, but for all of us. I want us to hear the good news that God sent Gabriel to bring to Zechariah, that was written down by Luke for us to read. Now, Luke, each of the four Gospels have their own specific purpose, and Luke was specifically written an orderly account. It's written down by a physician, and he wanted things in order, and so he wanted it to be an orderly account, and it was specifically to help the people who had not grown up in Jewish faith to understand that Jesus was the Messiah, but not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles as well. And here he starts with a story about Elizabeth and Zechariah. And it opens up reminding of Zechariah the priest and Elizabeth. They were both from the line of Aaron, and he was in the priestly order of Abijah. And in the time period, unlike today, it wasn't a calling that you experienced and then you chose to follow or not to go into the clergy. He knew, his parents knew from the time that he was born that that's what he would do. Because their family lineage, their genealogy determined what work they do. So he had been a priest ever since he had reached a certain age. Can you imagine their family reunions where every single man in the room is a priest? How much shop talk would take over? That makes me want to look at Reverend Callie, all her family pastors just about. I bet shop talk happens sometimes there. But every man in this particular family would have a priest. And so they would have been familiar with the story of the Old Testament. They would have been familiar with the story of infertility, the story of Sarah, and the story of Hannah. And yet, even knowing those stories and how they used Sarah and Hannah, they are both experiencing the judgment of their community. Did you know the first thing that's said about them is that they were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. Friends, that's a high compliment. But yet in the very next sentence we read, but they had no children because Elizabeth was barren and both were getting on in years. There's been this concept that has been consistent over the years, and not every person believes it, but there's enough people who do that I feel like it's important for us to acknowledge it. And that is that just because things are not going right in your life does not mean that God is angry with you, does not mean that you are not being the person God has called you to be. Because the very first thing it tells us about them after telling us their lineage is that they were righteous before God, but yet they were still having this great struggle. So you here this morning, if you are going through a great struggle, or if someone you know is, that it doesn't mean that that struggle is somehow a punishment. That's the first piece of good news, the first word of hope I want us to hear. And we'll see at the end that God shows them a future beyond what they could have imagined. Next, I want to see that as Zechariah is faithfully serving within his particular days, chosen to have this remarkable opportunity to approach God in the temple alone, to give incense offering as the entire congregation was outside. Now, before the years of COVID, I had a hard time imagining this, because every time that we would gather for work, we would gather together. That's what happened during COVID. I'd preach alone to my iPhone, and all the congregation was outside. But in this moment that Zechariah is there believing that he is alone in the sanctuary, all of a sudden the angel of the Lord appears, and it tells us twice that he's terrified and very afraid. Anybody ever been in a big room, all of a sudden somebody comes in and it startles you? Well, imagine that somebody is the angel Gabriel. So he's startled, and the angel Gabriel gives to him peace by piece, ton of information. As one of my colleagues puts it, it's information overload. As told, this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen. Anybody else ever wish from time God would tell us that? This, and then this, and then this, and then this. But how does he respond? He's a little overwhelmed. So the first thing that the angel tells him is to not be afraid. We see this commonly as the first thing that's stated by an angel. But then he says these words, your prayer has been heard. Your prayer has been heard. And it reminds me of those prayers that sometimes people pray for years and years and years, begin to think that because they have not had the answer from God that they desired, that God is not hearing them. And I want to say to you that if you are in one of those places, you are not alone. I remember around the year 2009, 2010, that some of the writing Mother Teresa came out, in which she had written in her journal that there were years that she felt God did not hear her. But yet she continued to remain faithful. And this was a time in which many of the Jewish people would have felt that way. Because you see, they had had this one promise from God about 400 years earlier. And it was that the prophet Elijah would come back. You can read about it in Malachi. But yet, for 400 years, they felt like they had not heard a word from God. I don't know about you, just months of not hearing messages or years are discouraging. And then you look upon this as 4 centuries. And yet, the first words after do not be afraid that come out of the mouth of an angel that's written about in the Old Testament, which Zechariah would have heard of, are your prayer has been heard. Friends, that's a word of hope, isn't it? But that means that we serve a God who listens to our prayers, whether or not it seems like before they're answered, or if they're answered in the way that we want them answered at all. With this information overload, your wife Elizabeth will have a son, and you will name him John. Those words would be a remarkable revelation, right? Can you imagine the joy and hope that he felt in that moment, or perhaps disbelief? I can't believe this is true. This is possible. We've been trying and praying for years, and yet here it is. You will have a son. You are to name him John, because you will have joy and gladness, and he will rejoice at birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. It's like, wow, even better, right? Of course we're going to rejoice at this long-awaited son. And then he talks about the special role that he will have, about how he's called to restrain from strong drink, and that the Holy Spirit is going to work through him as he had worked through Elijah. That he is going to help prepare the way for the Lord. Now, Zechariah, he's getting on in age, and perhaps years of disappointment have added on. It becomes harder and harder for him to believe that which seems impossible. But we need God who does what seems impossible. A family who was separated more than 15 years fighting with each other, who eventually did come to the Thanksgiving table together. I don't think that they thought it was possible to come back together. I'm reminded of how people's lives can be changed forever by just a little bit of hope. One of the traditions that my family had around the Christmas time, that especially my brother's family had, tied into St. Jude's Children's Hospital, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. And my brother would take his children to Toys R Us. This is a few years old because Toys R Us more, but he'd take his kids to Toys R Us, and he would have them choose a toy that they would want. He would take it and give it to children that had cancer at St. Jude's. Now, St. Jude's itself was founded on hope. As you might know, St. Jude is called the patron saint of hopeless causes. And when Danny Thomas went to found it, the survival rate for children with cancer was 20%. That meant 4 out of 5 children that were diagnosed with cancer passed passed away within 5 years. That seems like a hopeless cause, doesn't it? But yet he felt called by God to start the St. Jude's Children's Hospital. And guess what? Now the survival rate of the children there, 80%. Completely reversed. So that now 4 out of the 5 children survive. Now God called on him to do that, and God continues to call on people today to do that which seems impossible by the power of God. And here the power of God brings Elizabeth and Zechariah a child after years of prayers and years of waiting. So Zechariah, perhaps like many of us, how is this possible? For I'm an old man and my wife is getting on in years. And the angel replies, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But because you didn't believe that they will be fulfilled in time, you will be mute until the day that these things occur. On this point of the story, we see that Zechariah has been promised all wonderful things. He finds it a little hard to believe. And what happened? He's given a sign/punishment. But what's the most important part of what happens? God's promise to Elizabeth and Zechariah is still fulfilled. Even though Zechariah went through that moment in which he had trouble believing, and there were consequences from that, God still gives them hope and future. So a piece of good news that comes from this angel Gabriel today is that even if we've had times that we don't believe, if we've had times to believe that the idea that God came through Jesus Christ and lived and died and was raised for us too impossible to believe, that God is still reaching out to us, wanting us to have life of hope. Still reaching out, offering a future beyond what we could imagine. Now, does that mean that it will be the future right now? No. We believe that believing in God gives us a Ferrari or the best computer or whatever it is that we want. We don't even believe that it means the exact family that we want. We saw this here in the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah. They were faithful, yet they did not yet have what they wanted. But it does prove God's faithfulness, that this Emmanuel, that we've seen the name of God, God with us, is present with them through the entire day. Listening to their prayers even when they think they may not be heard, offering hope in a future even when those prayers are answered but they're hard to believe. And yes, standing beside them through the journey. If you he leaves the sanctuary, Zechariah does, and the people are outside and they've been waiting for him, and he can't talk. Friends, I've served several churches, and every church has its own rumor mill. Can you imagine the rumor mill that got started when the priest was, and then he couldn't talk when he got there? Yet we see here that he goes home to Elizabeth, unable to talk. And God's will, God's hope for them is still fulfilled. I've thought about that communication barrier, but in part, it would have been even more significant than today. We see that he went out to his congregation and he was making signs. I think it would be comical if I tried to do a little of, try to get preaching today. I decided to. I don't make a very good time. But he went home to his wife, Elizabeth, still unable to speak, and because of the time period, it's extremely unlikely she would have had the education to have been able to read. So can you imagine that situation? She becomes pregnant finally, and she stays in her seclusion for 5 months. In verse 25, we get a little bit of clue where she says, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have heard among my people." I wonder if part of the reason that she hid for the 5 months that she was hiding until it would have shown that she was actually pregnant. She would have been ridiculed by her community at that time period because having a child is the very definition of what you want it to be and a security for your future. Perhaps that is why she stayed for the 5 months. Perhaps it was to be alone with God and alone with her husband. Can you imagine the quietness of those 5 months? She's in seclusion and her husband can't talk. Maybe she slept a whole lot. We don't know. But it tells us that sometimes that work that God is doing in us doesn't on the outside for a while. Sometimes that work that God is doing in your heart, in your mind, or in your soul, in your life, does not show in a tangible way that you recognize for a while. There's this phenomenon that happens to women, especially in cultures where they don't have the medical advances that we have, where they will begin to believe they're pregnant and their body will even respond as if they are. I wonder if Elizabeth had experienced that or known women who had. Perhaps she waited the 5 months to prove it. After all, how is she going to explain a husband who can't talk and how she's pregnant and late in life? But we can't explain all that God does. Earlier in the children's message, we were reminded of what faith means. And yes, we label each of these candles hope and peace and joy and love. These gifts that God gives us, the power of Jesus Christ, are words that cannot be fully explained, right? So part of what I want us to remember as we look at the sights and we hear the sounds of this season, remember that it's because of Jesus Christ, is that those great gifts that God offers us are often ones that can't be fully expressed in words. The hope, the peace, the joy, the love of God goes beyond what we could ever say or what we could ever do. The last words that Zechariah said were words of doubt. But after the child is born, the first words that Zechariah speaks are words of hope and praise in God. So hear this day. If you feel an emptiness in your heart, still hears your prayer. If you feel emptiness in the story of Jesus Christ, that it feels like it is too good to be true, God will still be there and offer you a good hope and future when you are ready to listen to it, when you are ready to accept it, when you are ready to consider it. And that you've been ridiculed by society and blamed because of the bad things that happen to you, that work that God is working in your heart that you may not see yet, it will come to fruition. Elizabeth lived for 5 months in the quietness. Perhaps in the quietness or emptiness, God too is creating something within us that will change our world and perhaps even the world. For John the Baptist, her child, was the one that claimed Jesus Christ. He was the spirit of Elijah come, a promise fulfilled to the Jewish people, but not just to them, but to all who believe. May we remember that with hope this season. Amen.